Hi guys, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about the different places that therapists and counselors can work. I think most of us assume that therapists and counselors only work in like hospitals and in private practice, but there's actually a lot more places than that. So we're going to go through the list of all the different places that you can work once you're qualified, if you are not yet a qualified counsellor. So let's get into it. So at number one, like I've already mentioned before, we have hospitals and GP surgeries. Not all GPs have a counsellor and psychotherapist, but a lot more are starting to, because the NHS is starting to invest more and more in mental health services. So you'll find that sometimes your local GP might have a counselling service as well. So it just depends. It might not be in your local area, but in the next few years, I think we'll see an increase in more therapists and counsellors working in GP surgeries. In hospitals, there definitely is. There's, obviously a mental health sector within the NHS where a lot of therapists can work and do work, especially in CBT. That's very popular within the NHS. And there's a high demand for therapists and counsellors in the NHS and in hospitals in general. But this is not just the NHS. A lot of counsellors and therapists also work in private hospitals. So you might have heard of things like Bupa, Newfield Health, and other private healthcare companies that are around. They will also offer counselling and mental health services, which you can access if you have private healthcare. Next up, we have the workplace. So wherever a place of business is where like large companies have a lot of employees. Nowadays, some companies are starting to hire like in-house counsellors. So even where I work at a private hospital. They have in-house counselling where you can access counselling for free. I'm also aware that some large corporate companies who can obviously afford it have in-house counsellors so that their employees can also access free counselling should they need it, and it's free from what I understand. So you can also check if your company is one of those companies. I'm sure any big company that whether that's like NatWest or JP Morgan or something like that, I'm sure big companies like that will probably have in-house counsellors. It's just a matter of asking about it, because of course, who would say no to free counselling? We know it's very expensive. So I think in the next few years, once again, we're likely going to see a surge and increase of in-house counsellors in a lot of corporate companies and a lot of workplaces where most of the time I believe it should be accessible for free for employees. And don't be afraid to ask your workplace if they have them. Don't even be afraid to request that they consider having in-house counsellors if they're a big company and they have the budget for it. So that would also be a really, really great thing. At number 3, we have addiction agencies and rehab centres. So counsellors and psychotherapists can also be found in rehab centres and addiction agencies. So of course, addiction and all of the things that come with that are very psychological and they do have an effect on your mental health. So it only makes sense that counsellors would be there as part of the rehabilitation process and improving your mental health, as well as learning how to live without your addiction and how to get over your addiction. You'll also find in places like that there's also psychologists, but counsellors are also there, usually in a group setting, sometimes in a one-on-one setting, depending on the place itself and how they run things and how much they can afford, whether a group therapist or a one-to-one therapist. But you can work there as well if you want. But with that one, it's a bit more specialized. You would have to get a training in addiction and understanding the trauma and the weight that comes with addiction. So you wouldn't just be able to get regular training and start working there. You would need to build up your experience and get extra training to be able to work with people who have addictions. So keep that in mind if that appeals to you and if it's something that you would like to do and if it's a field that you'd like to work in. At number 4, we have disability support groups. So as a counsellor and therapist, of course, people with disabilities of all sorts will definitely be impacted by it in different ways, and it will take a toll on their mental health. So you can also do like a group setting and just be a facilitator and a counsellor for people who have disabilities that they are wanting to talk about, especially maybe if it's a newly diagnosed disability, something that they've never had to deal with, something that's quite life-changing. Then you as a counsellor, you will definitely be needed in order to help them get through that and to understand what they're going through and to help them adapt to life with a new disability. And even for people that have been living with it, just to be able to manage and have somebody to help them cope with it along the way. So that's another option as well. At number 5, we have charities and helplines. So with charities and helplines, sometimes it's a paid role, sometimes it's an unpaid role. But it's up to you. Obviously, if you want to go for a paid role, you can. But if you can volunteer your time for free, that would also be very great. Because I know sometimes some therapists and counsellors will volunteer with charities like Shout and Mind, maybe like once a week, just because they can give back to the community. So you can work within a charity or a helpline, paid or unpaid, using your skills. So this will sometimes usually be over the phone. Some charities, obviously like mine, will have face-to-face therapy as well. So there's going to be an option depending. If you're going to work with helplines, then obviously it's going to be over the phone, or it might even be an email or text service, depending on where you choose to work. So be wary of that as well. So that's also something that you can opt to do. But with helplines, one thing is that you'll have random callers that you'll speak to different people. So there won't be a continuity or a building of a therapeutic relationship unless somebody says like, can I call you every time that you're on shift? Because sometimes people will do that because they like you specifically. But of course, it varies. So chances are when you're in a helpline, you won't get to develop that therapeutic relationship. It will just be like a one-off call with lots of different people within a shift. And you would have to get training specifically from the helpline, especially if you've never done telephone work before or if you've never worked with that helpline charity before. There is also a high demand for counselling in charities and in helplines, so expect that you'll have a lot of work and a big caseload of people to talk to. At number 6, we have educational institutions, so this includes schools, colleges, sixth forms and universities. Nowadays, there's been an increase in a need for counsellors within those educational settings, where I think in the last 10 years there really wasn't. But as some of you know, if you've been watching my channel for a while, that I did my placement in a school for almost a year last year. And they also have a school counsellor there that works there part-time. And most schools nowadays do have counsellors who are either full-time or part-time. So if working with children appeals to you or working with young adults appeals to you, this is also something that you can do. And if you have like regular counselling training, you can work with anyone 16 and above. But if you want to work with children under 16, you'd have to get extra special training for that. So even when I was doing my placement, I could only work with people who are above 16, which is why I only counselled students from the sixth form and not from the entire school. So keep that in mind. You also need a lot of experience to work with kids. So most schools want you to have had experience working with children. So if you're going to do a placement, try and pick a school or a university so that you can show that you've had experience working with children before. So that's another place. And I think in the next few years, we'll probably definitely see an increase in most schools, if not every school, having an in-house counsellor, because now the mental health of children is being really acknowledged and it's being spoken about a lot more, especially because of the pandemic. So if you want to work in a school, be sure to look out for your local schools and if they have counsellors. At number 7, we have hospices. So yes, people who might be having long-term healthcare problems and are close to the end of life, counsellors are usually there, not just to support the individual, but also to support their families and friends and relatives who are struggling to deal with grief and mourning the relationship or mourning the end of the life of the person that they love. So counsellors can also be found working in those places to support people through grief. So in this case, chances are you would probably need some sort of training in grief therapy or just understanding grief a lot more and loss and working through that. So if this sounds interesting to you, then I would highly recommend looking at grief training of some sort, trauma training of some sort, because that's what it's going to be surrounding. And also just be wary, of course, you're going to be working with people who are dealing with a lot of deep and sad emotions. You're going to be working around death a lot. Just consider whether that will be the right thing for you as well. At number 8, we have private practice. Of course, this is an obvious one. A lot of counsellors and psychotherapists start their own private practices and they are everywhere. Like there's a limitless amount of private practices. And unfortunately, they're not really well regulated, but it's important that you as a counsellor have your qualifications and your registration set and everything, so that should there ever come a time when this field does become regulated, which has been in the works and some people have been trying to get it through Parliament, which will probably happen at some point in the future, just to ensure that you have your right qualifications and you have what it takes to stay open should those regulations come into place. So private practice is good. You can set your own hours, you can set your own prices, and you don't have to work with anybody or answer to anybody. So you control your own schedule and you work whenever you please. So you can work in your home, and obviously you can choose to just work online if you don't want people going in and out of your house, which is something you also have to consider, the safety of that many people knowing your address and where you live, because some clients might not be, sane. Some people might not have the boundaries to realize that they can't just come to your house whenever they have a crisis, because I've heard some stories and yeah, it's not okay. So just consider how you'd feel about people knowing where you live and the possibility of them just turning up. especially if maybe they have a crush on you or if they have erotomania or something like that. You can also work obviously in your own office if you hire out a building, or you can just hire out a room in a building. You can just book a room within a building that is specifically for counsellors, so it's going to be quiet, there's going to be no distractions, because the only people there are other counsellors who would rather use like a space than their own home for therapy. So that's also an option in terms of private practice. At number 9, we have mental health facilities and hospitals. So like I said, I work in a mental health hospital specifically. It's not like the NHS. It's a private mental health facility. So in there are psychologists who speak to the patients at the hospital, but I haven't seen many counsellors. But a lot of the time, because the patients have psychosis and they have very severe mental health issues, sometimes they don't like to speak to counsellors, so they don't usually speak to counsellors or even the psychologists. But that doesn't mean that you can't apply for those jobs. So definitely look around and see if you can find counselling jobs within mental health facilities if that's something that interests you. Just be aware, like I said, that these patients are people who have psychosis, who have a wide range of mental health issues, very severe depression, schizophrenia is very common, personality disorders, anxiety, sometimes even eating disorders can appear in those places. You have patients who are on very strong medications, strong psychotic medications, and that's something you have to consider. What if they're hearing voices? What if they are dissociating? How are you going to work with them? Is that something that you're willing to go through the practice of training and learning and gaining the competency and the experience to be able to work with them? Because it's not going to be like working with a regular person who's not on any strong medications. Because I work in this place, I don't work there as a counsellor, but I can see how powerful the medications are. It's like two completely different people when they're on medication versus when they're not. So that's something that you have to really consider, whether you'd be okay working with that, because it's not going to be as simple as working with somebody who's not on medication and who's not diagnosed with a psychotic disorder of some sort. And at number 10, we have working in courts. And in that sense, I don't mean that you are working in a court. I mean as in you work with people who have court-ordered therapy. So for whatever reason, they've been told by the judge in court that they have to go and receive court-ordered therapy because it's mandatory for them to not get a sentencing or something like that. Keep that in mind. Is that something you'd like to work with? Because obviously you'll be given a caseload as and when. You're not going to be as in control of it. That's something to keep in mind. So court-ordered therapy is also an option. Would you want to work in the law system and providing therapy to people who have to receive court-mandated therapy? And also, I think that there's also going to be an expectation that whatever notes you do write, there's a chance you might have to share them or be asked to come into court to give a testimony of the client and your experience of the client that you had. That's also a very different environment to work in. So I hope that helps, and I hope that it's opened your eyes to seeing all the different locations that you can work as a counsellor and therapist. And be also sure to watch the video that I did with advice for future counsellors and therapists. I will have that linked here at the end of this video, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.